You're listening to Were You Still Talking? Here we go. Hey, welcome back. This is Were You Still Talking? I am Joel Albrecht, and today on the show I have an amazingly accomplished person. Dr. Guy Windsor is a world-renowned instructor and pioneering researcher of medieval and Renaissance martial arts, which I've heard of but never met anyone directly who does it. He's been teaching the art of arms full-time since founding the School of European Swordsmanship in Helsinki, Finland in 2001. His day job is finding and analyzing historical swordsmanship. Oh, I knew I'd mess that up. Maybe I'll edit this. His day job is finding and analyzing historical swordsmanship treaties, figuring out the systems they represent, creating a syllabus from these treaties for his students to train with, and teaching the system to his students all over the world. Guy is the author of numerous classic books about the art of swordsmanship and is consultant in sword fighting and game design and stage combats. And stage combat is what I'm trying to say, which all of these things have always interested me. Always been really excited about that. He developed the card game Audadia, I knew I'd pronounce that wrong, based on Fleur de Lebris's Art of Arms, his primary field of study. In 2018, Edinburgh University awarded him a PhD by Research Publications for his work recreating historical combat systems. Guy Windsor, welcome to the podcast. Very nice to meet you.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you too.
This is a very unique field of study. It has always interested me. I've never actually bought a sword, but I'm rethinking that idea again. How did this come about? Has it always been something that you were interested in, like from childhood?
Well, it's kind of complicated. I mean, I started out being into martial arts generally, and I've always had a fascination for blades. Just blades are cool. I just like swords. There's no reducing it. Some people like cars, other people like football, some people just like swords.
Right.
And so I did sport fencing at school. And when I got to university, I was doing Monday and Wednesday nights was sport fencing, Tuesday and Thursday nights was Tai Chi, Fridays was Kabuto, which is Japanese weapon stuff. Saturday was karate. They opened up an Aikido club at one point at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, and I went to that. And basically, if it was a martial art, I'd do it. And if it was actual like university studies, it came a distant second to the martial arts stuff. But the thing is, modern sport fencing is, it's a sport and a game that has evolved from or been developed from classical fencing of the 19th century. And it has very little relationship to what you actually do in a sword fight. So I was a bit frustrated with it because I was wanting to do real sword fighting, and that was the closest thing I could find. And other people were similarly frustrated. This is in the early 90s. And so we sort of got together and started fencing each other according to rules that made more sense to us. And then we discovered, there are actual books written by people who really knew how to sword fight back in the time when if you made a mistake in a sword fight, you were going to die, not lose a point, actually die. So let's have a look at those books and see if we can figure out how they're telling us to fight. And it just sort of developed from there. We started a club. After a while, I moved to Finland and opened my school. And it's just, I've just been doing that ever since, really.
And it's just kept going. Well, I mean, it seems like most young boys, at least I sure was, are pretty fascinated with swords. And, the
girls too.
Girls too, yeah, it's true. This is true. I mean, it's been in the movies forever. Errol Flynn was famous for really fencing. But you've already answered one of my questions, kind of the difference between fencing and sword fighting. But another one of my questions is there any sort? Well, there's a couple. I have a couple. It's kind of a two-part question. One is, how long do you think a sword combat would actually last? And the second one is, are any of the movie depictions of these fights where they just nick each other and walk away, do you realistic, or do you think that was ever a thing?
Okay, sword fights can last almost any amount of time depending on the situation and the goals. So, for example, there have been periods in European history where a sword fight might be a judicial combat where there's a challenger and someone who has been challenged over a point of law. Like did you murder this person? But there are no witnesses. I am challenging you, saying you murdered. And if the challenger fails to win before the allotted time runs out, they have been deemed to be slanderous, and in a capital, if you slander someone over a capital crime, you get hanged. And
jeez.
And if the person who has been challenged is simply still standing at the end, they have won. Okay, so the challenged person just had to stay alive, and the challenger had to prove their case. Okay, so but then there are other occasions where, you know, you're meeting at dawn on a romantic misty morning, and there's in a forest maybe, and there's a clearing, and you know the seconds and everything, and you're having the fight, and you kind of want to get it over with quite quickly because the police might show up. And you know, so also, actually, you mentioned movies. One of the absolute best duels of cinema history isn't actually European sword fighting at all. It's from Akira Kurosawa's, I'm mispronouncing his name, his Seven Samurai.
Oh, yes.
And there's this fantastic duel where this guy's been like challenged and what have you. Like, oh, yes, I can beat you. No, you can't. Leave me alone. And eventually they have a fight with bamboo. And it's obvious to the person who knew what they were doing that they won, but the other person wouldn't take it. So they moved to swords. And it's one move. So this guy comes towards him and he cuts him down. Boom, end of story. Right? That is, in many respects, the ideal sword fight.
Right.
Over very quickly. Right. It's a single move. But I mean, we have the term like fencing, like to fence around an issue, which is that sort of exploratory bish bash bosh as the blades kind of, you know, if I do this, what do you do? Da, 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 not committing to anything, because as soon as you commit to something, then blood is likely to be spilled, yours or the other person's, and you want to be absolutely sure it's going to be theirs. And so in that sort of fencing period, you have you're testing out your opponent, seeing how they're going to respond to what you're going to do, and also you're trying to tell them various lies about what you're going to do, and then the end comes quickly. So there is no one optimal length for a sword fight. It really depends whether you have time for all of that sort of exploratory work, and also it could be that it's a public duel, and if people are watching and you're in a sort of military culture, the absolute last thing you can afford is to appear to be afraid to go in.
Right. Oh, right.
So in that sense, it's probably better to take a few risks, because if you win, but in a kind of not very convincing way, and you're not really, you sort of, then, you know, your reputation won't survive it. Right.
Right.
And the duel particularly is entirely a social phenomenon. Right. You go into a duel because the social pressure to duel is so extreme that it is literally the rational thing to do to risk your life in the fight. That is a better trade than declining to duel. And there are many historical examples of this. I think Aaron Burr, one of the vice presidents of the United States, got killed in a duel that he didn't want to fight.
Yeah, there's a play about that recently.
Right. And the Duke of Wellington, right? Famous victor of Waterloo, Prime Minister of Britain, massively famous soldier. No one could possibly call him a coward with any basis. And I think it was the Earl of Winchelsea who said something in Parliament that the Duke simply could not afford to ignore. And so they ended up fighting a duel with pistols, right? Which is nuts, because the Duke was absolutely against the practice of dueling. He thought it was stupid and dangerous and bad for the military, because best case scenario, you lose one brave officer.
Right.
So it's like there's no, so he was against it, and yet the social pressures were there in a sufficient degree that people did it anyway. And well, some people liked it.
And it still goes on. I mean, this happens now, probably more in the U.S. than a lot of European countries, but it's still that way. They don't call it a duel; they call it a fight. But where there used to be fist fights, now it often involves firearms, especially at bars and things. It's kind of gone back to the old West in a lot of ways. So it's kind of the same thing where
Yeah.
people are embarrassed to back down. And if I'm not going to back down, well, I'm going to pull my gun. Oh, you've got one too. And it
Right.
kind of goes from there, you know.
And the thing
It still happens.
if they back down, then the chances are good that they will regret having done so, because they will lose all of their status, and without their status, they have no protection. Right. So
Right.
there's good reason for it. I mean, it's the reason that dueling died in Europe is because, I mean, it had been illegal for a long time, and people just did it because, so what? It's illegal. Who cares? Right. You're probably going to get away with it. In fact, most duelists who were then arrested and tried for murder got off, because it's still, you know, it's illegal, but
it was fair, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
Illegal,
exactly.
but it was fair.
Right. Okay. But what happened was the culture changed, and so it just became ridiculous to do it.
Right.
It became like grandpa might have fought a duel, but that was grandpa.
Right. Okay.
That was like 40
That's
years
ridiculous.
ago. That's
Yes.
yeah. These old-fashioned old people, they did this stupid thing, and we don't want anything to do with it. Basically, dueling died because the young laughed at it.
Oh, that's interesting. That is really interesting. But that also it reminded me of something that I think a lot of people don't have a clear image of. Like, you're studying you're studying like pre-fencing type of martial arts, right? So what are the different time periods of the kind of combat martial arts you're doing compared to the era of basically where fencing foils come from, and that era?
Okay. Our earliest historical source, and it's one that I do work with, is dated to around 1340.
Oh, wow.
And that is Medieval Sword and Buckler. And it's this fantastic book with a priest teaching his scholar, who's also dressed as a monk. And they're doing these sword and buckler techniques. So a buckler is a small round shield held in the fist, and the sword is like a single-handed knightly sword. Okay. And so they are fencing with these, and it's a beautifully created, beautifully structured exposition of what you should do with sword and buckler according to this priest. And incidentally, we mentioned women earlier. There is a woman depicted in that book with sword and buckler taking a lesson from the priest. Okay?
Oh, that's interesting. So it goes back
throughout 1340.
History. Right.
You know, I have occasionally come across the notion that girls can't fence, and it's like, well, we know for a sure and certain fact they've been doing it for getting on for 700 years.
Wow.
Right. Okay. So then I do various other systems which are more recent than that. The last of which is 18th century small sword, which is based on a book that was written in 1767. No, sorry, 1763.
Okay.
That there's at least like 40 or 50 years more fencing after that, but it was all basically the same. It didn't change much. And during that period, pistol dueling became more common. So by the 19th century, most dueling was done with pistols, and fencing became more academic. And then we have, by the middle of the 19th century, we have what we call classical fencing, which developed into the sort of foil, épée, and saber that we know today. And then that remained relatively unchanged. I mean, there were developments and what have you, but it was still recognizably the same art.
Right.
Until 1950s, when they started electrifying fencing, so that the registry of hits would be more accurate.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that long that they've been doing that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And then when fencing became electrified, it really started to change quite rapidly. And like in the 1970s is when you get the people sort of jumping back and forth and flicking at each other. Because a guy called Johann Harmenberg figured out how to win with épée according to the rules and with this equipment, and without really much reference to the art of fencing as it had been taught up to that point, right? And when he went and won his men's individual and men's team épée gold medals at the Olympics in 1980. That was basically it.
So he, in modern parlance, he figured out how to cheat.
No, he did not cheat. He absolutely did not cheat. What he did was he recognized that fencing was, that the sport, as it has been codified with this equipment and these rules, the old way of doing it just made no sense. It's more like the Fosbury flop, right? Where in high jump, people were doing these pathetic little high jumps where they kind of run up and sort of skip over the bar.
Oh, right.
And then that Fosbury guy came along and does it completely differently and suddenly starts winning everything. And then everybody's doing it.
Everyone had to, because he was winning by like a foot.
Right, exactly.
Yes, that's right. Okay.
I don't blame Johan Harmenberg for figuring out how fencing should be done in the modern age with this equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I blame the people who electrified fencing in the first place, which basically ruined it because it meant that all you had to do was get your light to light up by completing the circuit before your opponent did, or well, according to the rules or what have you. But basically, in épée, for instance, if my point hits you, I think it's 0.2 of a second before you hit me, I get the point.
Oh, right.
So it doesn't actually matter what happens after I've hit you, as long as you don't hit me in that 0.2 of a second, right? And it doesn't matter whether I've just like scratched you on the calf, and 0.3 of a second later you run your sword right through me, I still get the point, right? So
that's why it looks so bizarre. Watching it on the Olympics, it's like, what are they doing? What are they doing?
They are very high level athletes.
Doing
something very, very difficult, very, very quickly at an extraordinarily high level. It just doesn't bear much relationship, as far as I can see, to what you would want to do if the swords were sharp and your opponent was trying to murder you. And that is, for better or worse, where my interest lies.
Right. Well, it's kind of more interesting to a lot
I
of
would
us.
say so.
I
know sport fencers who love sport fencing, and why shouldn't they?
Why shouldn't they? Because it is an incredible high level exercise and system. I know it's really high. I know some people who are fencers, and it's very difficult, and it's a great exercise. You mentioned, I think, at least four or five martial arts that you started training in when you branched out. Do you still do all those different martial arts, or have you kind of narrowed it down because of time? Or
well, initially. I mean, I'm a bit of a martial arts junkie. I've trained lots of different martial arts, and whenever I get the opportunity to train a different one, I take it, because
that's great.
Like I've done Savat sparring, a top class Savat person who obviously completely beat the crap out of me, but in a kind of in a sort of martial arty proper way. There's no malice in it, right? But I'm not going to pass up the chance to train with someone who is good at a martial art, because, martial arts are all interesting, and, they all have the thing that they're designed to be good for. So, for example, modern kickboxing is designed to win medals in the kickboxing ring, which has, depending on which federation you're with, there are different rules and what have you. Like, for example, in many cases, you cannot kick below the waist, right?
Right.
And so it's high kicks, and that's there to make it look better and be more interesting to watch, right? Likewise, judo. I mean, I've never trained judo because I've never happened to have the opportunity to do it particularly seriously, which is a massive gap in my education, I'm happy to admit. But like in judo, you get the point for putting the person down on their back. Right. Now, if they are holding a knife, or if it is any kind of real situation, you want them on their front. But if they're on their front, they can't move. They can't use their arms and legs so well. I mean, you can't fight someone who's behind you. Right. But if they're on their back, they can keep fighting. Right. So it allows for a much more interesting wrestling match if you score by putting them on their back.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because as they're going down, if they can just avoid both shoulders hitting the mat at the same time, they can keep fighting, and it's cool. Put them down their front, as arresting officers will tend to do,
Mm-hmm.
right, for good reason, then, the fight's over. Okay. So it really depends on what you want the martial art to do. And they're all different. They all have their different sort of cultural ideals, context in which they're supposed to work. Most martial arts, in my experience, have at least a dollop of bullshit in them, where they make claims that aren't strictly accurate. Right? But, as long as you're aware of that.
Well, it's kind of what the whole Ultimate Fighting was created for, to supposedly show that, only my martial art is going to work and nothing else.
Right.
And which is why, and to me, it's quite boring now, because if it works, you're going to get someone on the ground and kind of beat the crap out of them. And it's going to look the same every time. So it got a bit like, I've seen this match. Guess what? The strong guy wins.
In the very early days, it was more interesting because you got stylists from different styles coming in and fighting each other.
Exactly. That was far more interesting to me.
You have a karate guy against a judo guy or whatever, and that was more interesting.
And once the Gracies came in and beat everyone, it was like, well, I'm going to have to learn that.
But they did what Harmonberg did with fencing.
Exactly.
They looked at the rules, they looked at the environment, and they figured out the best strategy for winning, and they are superbly good at that, and their students or whatever have gone on to win many titles or whatever, because it works and it's a very high level skill and whatever, and it's not my thing. I'm more of a weapons person.
Right.
Because I'm fundamentally lazy, and the thing is,
it's lazy to learn swordsmanship.
Yes, because okay, in a let's say you're in a boxing match, right? It's a lot of really hard work, and you have to punch a lot and get punched a lot, and it's hard work. Yeah, and the amount of effort it takes to stick a sword through a person is about the same amount of effort as it takes to offer them a cup of tea.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
I guess now, you got a point there.
We do the push-ups and squats and all that sort of physical training as well, because it's useful. Strength is useful. Yes. But what weapons do is they equalize things to a great degree. Okay? And, with I'm blanking on his name, but the leader of the English Knights at Agincourt, right? Full armor, poleaxe, on foot. He was renowned for being short. Okay? Yeah. But he is like the most highly regarded knight in English chivalry at the time. Yeah. So you don't have to be a big bloke to win if you're using swords or weapons or poleaxes or whatever. I mean, sometimes it helps. Every world-class epais is tall and thin.
Oh, interesting. Because they're long, those long
Yeah,
arms,
exactly. They want to hit you from far away.
Yeah.
Most really good wrestlers tend to be short and wide. Because it just works better. Swimmers tend to have long backs and big feet. Yeah. Right? I mean, any given sport will have its ideal body type. But with swords, we have so many different swordsmanship styles that there really isn't an ideal body type for swords in general. For instance, if you're into medieval combat and wrestling is a part of what we do, then actually having a low center of gravity can be an advantage.
Oh, interesting. So, getting back to the medieval combat, this is another. I went to a trade show for movies. It was years and years ago, but there was a weapons person there who had an array of swords, and he was, according to him, much more accurate than most. And he was letting people hold the broadswords, and mainly to show, look how light this thing is. So that is true. That's accurate. Yeah, because it was light and easy to throw around, whereas it seems a lot of broadswords I think are made wrong, and they're ridiculously heavy. And it's like, how would you do battle with that?
Exactly. I mean, it's useful to think of a sword as a tool. Right. And a tool you're supposed to be able to swing. If it's medieval combat, you might be in battle. It might go on for hours. Right. Yeah, this always amazed me that those battles went on sometimes for days,
in those days. It just
they
must have been incredibly healthy, incredibly strong.
Well, they were fit. I mean, they were professional warriors generally.
Yes.
Swords have always been expensive. And so, generally speaking, most sword-carrying people in the Middle Ages tended to be of the warrior class and had been trained since childhood in the art of arms. Okay, so a knight would very often be born into the son of a knight, so some sort of noble family, trained from the age of about 11 or 12, and at sort of 18, 19, maybe 20, would be knighted, which indicates that he's sort of completed his training and he's like it's like getting a commission in the army. Okay, you are now qualified to lead troops. Yeah,
right.
Knights had retinues that they would lead into battle. Okay. But let's get back to the weight of the swords. I mean, the heaviest sword I own is about 5'2" long. The crossguard is about 20 inches wide. The blade is about 3.5 inches wide at the crossguard.
Wow.
Okay? The thing is a beast.
Yeah.
And it weighs about 5.5 pounds.
Oh, that's amazing.
Right.
So easy to wield.
Yeah. Whereas a single-handed sword will very often weigh well under 2 pounds.
Right.
Speaking in American, of course.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that for the American podcast. So that segues perfectly into one of my questions. The sword collection, for those who are not watching the YouTube, which is most of the people listening to the podcast, he has a rack of swords behind him, and I'm curious what percentage of your collection does that represent? Like, how many swords do you have?
I don't actually collect swords. These are just the tools of my trade, and so I describe them quickly for the listeners. Okay, on the bottom row of the rack, there is a single-handed knightly broadsword. You could say we call it an arming sword. There are two of those. There's also a sharp longsword and a blunt longsword. And the longsword is about 4 feet long. Above that, there are two rapiers, one blunt, one sharp. The rapier has a very long blade. My rapier blades are about 42, 43 inches, and quite a fancy hilt, and the sword's held in one hand. On the rack above that, there is a 200-year-old cavalry saber, and behind that, there is a modern, reproduced 16th century Italian-style sword, which we would call a spada da filo. Above that, there's a rack with a Schiavona-style broadsword, which looks a bit like a Scottish basket-hilted sword, and two falchions, because I do like falchions. And then the line above that, there are two small swords. One of them is about 240 years old, and I use that for like solo training and what have you. And the other one behind it is a modern reproduction, which I can actually fence with.
Oh, I see.
So, and that's maybe hard to say. I would guess probably half of the swords that I actually own.
That you train with and own. The rapier has always been my favorite. I don't know why. I've always liked the design of that sword. It's beautiful.
They're pretty.
Yeah, they're pretty. That's it. They're pretty, and some of them are really pretty. Yes.
And many of my students and colleagues and friends are drawn to one specific weapon, and they do just that weapon and the sort of the weapons associated with it. So, for example, if you're doing rapier, you might do rapier and dagger, or rapier and cloak. Others, like me, I like pretty much everything from when records began in 1340 up until swords stopped being carried by gentlemen as sidearms. Okay, so around 1800. So that's my preference. And this is just the stuff I'm drawn to. I have no explanation for it. I prefer sidearms. So with guns, I prefer pistols and revolvers to rifles, just because I just like them more. I can use both, but and obviously, in an actual, like, if I had to join the army and do like nasty military stuff, I'd want a rifle, not a pistol. But if I got a choice to have just one to shoot for fun, I would take a pistol over a rifle every time. I just like sidearms better.
I would want two rifles and three pistols.
Well, I actually have three pistols in Finland where I have licenses for that kind of stuff, but you can't have them here in Britain. So, like, swords are sidearms. They're never the primary weapon. So a knight on a horse will have usually a lance.
Oh, right.
Right?
Right.
And when that breaks, or he gets in too close, out comes the sword. An archer would have usually a falchion. So when they've run out of arrows or the enemy breaks through, you don't want to be, trying to fight with a bow, because they're completely useless as quarterstaffs. That's one thing that really annoys me in movies, when people use bows like quarterstaffs. They just don't work that way. The mass distribution is entirely wrong.
Oh, right. That makes sense.
I can geek out on that as much as you want, if you like.
I've done enough martial arts to understand exactly what you're saying. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you just ruin your bow. But they have falchions, which is this kind of short, like a machete, really.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of size and shape. And yeah, for close quarter work, where they're too close for the bow to be useful, out comes the sidearm. And the same is true, knights on foot, or soldiers on foot generally. They're not using swords, they're using spears or pikes, polearms of some description, because you want to hit the person from far away, right? And it's the Romans that were kind of weird about it, right? What they would do is they would, behind their shields, they would march up and they would get super close, right? Close enough for this really short stabbing sword that we know as the gladius to go to work. So it's like maybe the whole thing is maybe 2 feet long or less.
Oh, God.
Sometimes they're really quite short.
Uh-huh.
But the pilum was used first, which is this sort of throwing spear that has this long, thin iron head and a sharp point. And the point of that is when you throw it, usually the barbarian running towards you has a shield. It hits the shield, and then the weight of the pilum bends the iron and stuck in the shield, and that drags the shield down. So they have to drop the shield. They don't have time to fiddle about. And so they're coming up against your shield without one.
And your little sword. Yeah.
And then they stay together in their very strict formations and they go to work. Now, I am not a scholar of Roman military stuff. So if anyone listening is, and I screwed that up, please send me an email and let me know how completely wrong I am. Because you managed to kind of get me to wander off my area of expertise.
That's what we're here for. I like people to wander off. That's always good. So UT. Oh, this is my thing. I'm a big movie buff, and one of the reasons I was kind of attracted to Game of Thrones, which is a movie, even though it's in many parts, is it seemed like a lot of the stuff they did had more realism, than some history-based films. I don't know if you saw that or not. And
I watched Game of Thrones. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a good example where the swords people were trained from birth. From birth, they were born to do that in almost every case.
But unfortunately, the way they actually use those swords, I mean, it got better as the series progressed. But no, not
so much. Yeah.
Really,
it was more
really,
show,
really
wasn't it?
Bad sword fighting.
Oh, okay.
Awful. I have a pet peeve about Sirio Forel, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he's teaching Arya to fence. Okay, here's the thing. The people learn really quickly that, if you behave in a certain way and you get hit, don't do it. Right?
Right.
It's very... Right. So when you're giving a fencing lesson, the rule is really simple. If the student is doing what they're supposed to be doing, they hit the teacher and the teacher does not hit them. Okay?
Oh,
that way they are rewarded for doing the right thing by getting the hit, and they are not punished for doing the wrong thing by getting hit. If they're doing the wrong thing, or they're doing the right thing but not at the level that they're supposed to be doing it at, then the teacher will not let them hit them and will probably hit them back. So they know that they've done something wrong. Okay? And that's the only feedback that matters in a sword fight. Did you strike and were you struck? Everything else is pretty much irrelevant.
Right.
Okay, so
sure.
What you see Sirio Forel do is bully and torment Arya. Everything she tries, he ends up basically just demonstrating his superior fencing skill and throwing her all over the place and whatever. And there's absolutely no way that a human being can be taught like that and turn out to be a decent fencer. It's impossible, right? Because everything she tried failed. So how would she learn to do it if it never works?
Right? That makes sense to me. Yeah.
It got me so angry. I watched it I was like, no, because it violated the thing I actually really care about with swords. You know, you expect in movies, you expect the sword fighting to be kind of flashy and, you know, sort of fun, and it's there to entertain, it's there to tell the story, it's not there to be accurate sword fighting.
Well, like the martial arts in movies, you know, it's you're not going to see Jackie Chan do something that's going to work necessarily.
Right. Well, I suspect Jackie Chan could probably make most of that stuff work. Yeah. Yes. But like when there's this trope in movies generally about the martial arts master, and I wish this trope would die. Okay, which is the martial arts master's job is to beat the shit out of the student until by some miracle they learn.
Oh, that's true. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is very true. Yeah.
Right. Now there are occasions where, and I speak from experience, where it is necessary to demonstrate upon the student why what they're doing doesn't work by hitting them or throwing them on the ground or whatever. Okay. And I've never experienced this personally, but I can see how it could happen in the stories that are being told on screen. It could be necessary for the master to sort of demonstrate to the student that they have the chops to actually teach them something by maybe the student challenges them and the master just beats the crap out of them. Right? But that's not a lesson. That's a job interview. Right? It's different.
Oh, right.
Yeah?
Right.
You have this over and over again. Like the way you become a good martial arts master, according to what you see on the screen, is you're supposed to beat up and humiliate your students and make sure nothing they do ever works. And that is just the absolute reverse of what you should be doing. Right? When a student comes to me, okay, I've been doing swords and stuff for like 30 years or something, and some total beginner, if I couldn't hit them whenever I felt like it, I have been totally wasting my time for the last 30 years.
Right.
So who learns anything by me, you know, just repeatedly like hitting the beginner because they can't hit me? Right? No, you set it up so that they're doing the thing, and if it's good enough based on their experience, you let it through, so they know that that's what they're supposed to be doing. And if they, you know, maybe they've made the strike and they have a habit of maybe kind of thinking, oh well, it's over now, and kind of dropping the sword and pulling back, which you should never do. Then maybe every time they drop the sword, you pump them gently in the face, and they very quickly stop dropping the sword. And so they learn to, you know, stay in the fight until they are completely out of measure. And they learn it really quickly, and they get better really quickly, because you only hit them when they have made a mistake, and the hit is enough that they know that it's happened, but never so much that that it's painful or distracting. You want them to know, but you don't want them to be derailed by it.
I completely understand this, because I did do martial arts when I was younger, and you know, I sparred. Every class I took, sparring was a big part of it, and if it wasn't, I would go to a different class. But everything I did, you know, sparring was important, and so I sparred with a lot of black belts. I sparred with degreed black belts. None of them would hit you. Actually, in the last martial arts class I took, when we were sparring, they said, just hit them as hard as you want to be hit. That's what they would. When you're sparring with the black, it's pretty good advice, because you do not want. If you don't want to get knocked out, don't try to knock out a black belt. And so yeah, but they were always very clear about, yes, I could have done damage there, but of course I'm not going to, except for the one time where a black belt ran into my fist, and that really scared me. That made me so nervous. But he was like, no, my fault.
Right, well, and that's the thing, right? Like in my style, if an accident occurs and there's a clear experience differential between the students, it is always the older student's responsibility what happened. Fault may be too strong a term, but it's always on them. If one or other of them gets you know, hit harder than they should or whatever. Because when you're training with someone less experienced than yourself, your job is to bring them up to your level, not to keep them down at theirs.
Right. And I mean, that's literally what happened. Is he didn't think I would think to throw a punch when he was coming in.
Right.
And I did.
Oh, good.
Like,
So he
oops.
learned. Excellent.
He learned.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
That was kind of funny, but yeah, it's scary as well. So where was I? Oh, so is there a film you can point to where they did do it right, or a film or a series where they actually did a fairly good job, or where maybe the stunt coordinator seemed to really knew what he was doing, and it looks fairly accurate or somewhat accurate. Is there anything out there like that?
Well, here's the thing. Yes and no. Like the one I mentioned, Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
Some of the duels in that. I have friends who train in really traditional Japanese sword fighting arts, and they look at those and go, that's pretty much what we're taught. Wow. Made a bit bigger and slower so the camera can see it, but that's pretty much what we're taught. Mm-hmm. In the European tradition sort of films, okay, my favorite sword fight is the duel at the top of the Cliffs of Insanity in The Princess Bride.
Oh, how great.
Which was just a fantastic sword fight.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Right? It's just cinematic, swordy heaven, but it bears no relationship whatsoever to an actual rapier duel. Right? And why should it? It's a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Right?
And after all, they're both trying not to hurt each other.
Right. Yes, they're two artists
that is their goal.
Artistic with each other.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
And then, I mean, the closest I can think of to really good sword fights on screen, which actually go the way I think they would go if it was real, Ridley Scott's The Duelist. Now, sadly, everything Ridley Scott has done since then, from a sword fighting perspective, has been absolute rubbish. Don't even get me started. I could get very cross, and that's not good for the listeners. So,
not the
right. But The Duelist, holy cow! It was the fights were choreographed by a guy called Bill Hobbs, and I mean the opening scene. You have an experienced cavalry officer with, who has killed many times before. It's just part of his job. He knows what he's doing, but doesn't fence small sword. And you've got a young man who is, I think, the son of the mayor of the town or something like that, and they're having a duel of honor. And
right.
The cavalry officer has probably never fenced with a small sword before, which is historically unlikely, but we can leave that. And the young man has probably had a few fencing lessons, and you can sort of see it. But the fight goes exactly the way you would expect that to, looking at it through sort of experienced fencing eyes. Right, it's beautifully done. And later on, there's a duel with cavalry sabers, where these two very experienced cavalry officers who have fought many times before, they are fighting each other with these swords, and they get so tired because it goes on so long because they're so equally matched that by the end they're basically kind of leaning on each other and sort of bleeding and just desperately trying to get one more smack in. It's perfect. Absolutely brilliant. Sorry,
I've heard of that. I've seen other people point to that as a very accurate portrayal of swordsmanship and extremely well done. Is. Yeah,
but none of the fights in that are good examples of the historical style brought to life on screen. So what we're seeing in the beginning is not a small sword duel between two expert small sword fencers.
Right.
We're seeing a cavalry officer and an inexperienced young man, and the cavalry officer. Well, the movie's been out for like 40 years, so spoiler alerts, no thank you. You're going to get the answer now.
Yes,
right?
It's been out a while. It's
the
Harvey.
Experienced killer does the killing.
It's Harvey Keitel, right? When he's a kid.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. The experienced killer does the killing, and that, honestly, that is probably also historically true.
Right. That makes sense. Sure.
And we see it in, like, modern fighter pilots too. Like looking at from the Second World War and Korean War and Vietnam War and what have you. Once a fighter pilot has like 3 successful fights behind them, something like that, they suddenly get much better.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there are books on this sort of combat psychology, which I've probably spent too much time reading.
So you have actually done. You said in your resume you've done some stage combat training. Have you ever done? Is that for? Tell me a little about that.
Okay.
You've trained some people for stage combat. Right. Have you ever done?
What happened is somebody else wrote my bio, and I copied and pasted it without reading it properly.
Oh, okay.
So the stage combat thing is massively overblown. I need to go in and correct that. Sorry. Okay. In the very early days, the closest thing we could find to training in historical systems was stage combat, because we got to use things like rapiers and rapier and dagger and things like that.
Oh,
so me and my friends did some actual stage combat training there. And that's been very useful for doing like demonstrations and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've put on loads of sword fights at like reenactment fairs and sort of medieval themed dinners and stuff like that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Loads of that. Done a little bit of choreographing and training actors to do sword fights on stage. But if somebody approaches me for that now, I have colleagues who are specialized in that area who I would point those people to. Because I can do it. And many moons ago, my niece was playing Captain Hook in her school play.
Mm-hmm.
And so I flew over and choreographed the fight between Captain Hook and Peter Pan at the end. Right?
Oh, that's great. That's fun.
I can do it. But yeah, and it was great. The kid who played Peter Pan, he was absolutely amazing. And I found out just sort of when we were having a break, he just did a one-handed cartwheel.
Oh my gosh!
Right. So I thought, you can do one-handed cartwheels. We're putting that in the fight. Let's do
that. Oh yeah.
So we did. It was absolutely fantastic. Right.
That is great.
But yeah, it's honestly, it's not really my area.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was professionals asking, these days I would send it to one of my professional colleagues.
Well, it's kind of an interesting point, because that it points out that it's a bit different. Stage combat is not medieval martial arts, right? It's a different thing. It's not really the same thing.
And the way I summarize the difference is, in a real sword fight, nobody sees what just happened and somebody dies. But in stage combat, everybody sees what happened and nobody dies.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
They are diametrically opposed
exactly.
in the outcome.
Right.
Right. The intended outcome is diametrically opposed. But there are massive amounts of overlap in skill set. So, for example, taking people who are experienced historical martial artists and teaching them how to fence. Well, on my own podcast, I had a guy called Ben Crystal, who is a very well-known Shakespearean actor in the UK, who specializes in original pronunciation of Shakespeare and has gone really deep into how Shakespeare's plays were produced in their own time, right? Including, how the stages were set, what sort of stages were being used, what effects they had access to, what sort of costumes they were wearing, all that kind of stuff. And given how very little time they had to rehearse, generally, it's obvious that they didn't choreograph blow-by-blow sword fights. But I've actually done this with colleagues when we had to put on a fight at a fairly short notice. We would agree a start, and one person would be sort of leading the fight, so the person sort of in charge, who would give the signal to move to the choreographed final kill, which might be, I tap twice on your blade, and you're going to attack on the inside line, and I'm going to parry, take your weapon away, and stab you. Right?
Yeah.
Something like that. So in between the start, which is like, yes, we are starting now, you just fence. With the understanding that you're not actually going to hit each other. You just fence. And then when it's gone on for long enough, the person leading it gives the signal, tap, tap, and then you go for the kill. Right? I've done that many times. It actually gives, in many respects, the most realistic looking sword fights, because
you don't know what you're not don't know what to expect. So I also saw the video you have on YouTube of you doing combat, like in protective gear. Is that a tournament or are those?
I don't know which video you're
you had broadswords. You had broadswords, and you had big, thick outfits, and I think you started without helmets, and then you put them on, and it looked like It looked like some kind of
Okay.
competition, but it may
I
not have
wouldn't
been.
fence anyone without without a mask on.
Oh,
So,
okay. It was.
so I'm not sure what video you're referring to, because I closed my YouTube channel like years ago. So all of my stuff is on Vimeo. But
Oh,
there are
then maybe
lots and
it was
lots
on
of
Vimeo then.
yeah. But there are lots. I've done lots of fencing matches, as you can
Right.
imagine.
Right.
Many of them got videoed by various people and stuck on various platforms.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so one of the things we do for fun, to test our interpretations, to test how we work under pressure, all sorts of things like that, is we put the gear on and we fence each other, more or less competitively, depending on the context. So what exactly is the question?
That was kind of the question, if there's actual competitions with broadswords, or if that's more about just fencing and having fun.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There are people who organize actual tournaments.
Mm-hmm.
That I haven't participated in one since about 2002.
Okay.
But I did loads of tournaments when I was doing sport fencing, obviously, because that's the primary thing you're training for.
Right.
And, then when I turned to, teaching for a living in 2001, and I went to a tournament in 2002, I think it was, and it went fine. I mean, I won it, but so what? Because everyone else there was an amateur. It didn't seem like it was really appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that again.
So
many of my students go to these tournaments. The issue with tournaments is the same as the issue with any other competitive sport. What ends up happening is you have, here's the equipment you're allowed, here is the rule set for this tournament, and the behaviors that work to win fights in the tournament are the behaviors that people will start to do. Yeah. And so a lot of what happens ends up looking a lot like kendo or like sport epee. And when it gets a bit too serious, I sort of lose interest, because it loses its ability to adequately test the things I'm interested in testing, which is, for example, how well does this technique work at speed under pressure? So do not do this at home. Do not do this. This is my job. I can take certain risks from a more informed perspective. But one thing we sometimes do is, with more or less protection, sometimes no protection at all, do the technique at full speed with sharp swords.
Ooh.
Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you get it wrong, there's a good chance you're going to die. Right? So that's not your first stage of testing.
I wouldn't think so.
that is, we've worked out this technique from the book. We've worked out that it works in this context. It seems to work slowly with blunt swords. It seems to work at speed with blunt swords. It seems to work at a lot of speed in varying contexts with blunt swords and equipment, protective equipment and what have you. Okay, let's try it slowly with sharp swords. Let's try it slowly with sharp swords and a bit of protection. Let's try it fast with sharp swords and a bit of protection. Let's try it at full speed with sharp swords and no protection. Right? It's a very, very dangerous process that, if you follow the right protocols, is actually very, very safe. All of the injuries that I'm aware of that were particularly significant, and bruises here and there come with the territory, but like concussions or broken bones or what have you, we get a little bit of that, far less than in, say, football, American football, or even ordinary football.
Or martial arts.
Right. But that all happens in tournaments.
Right.
Because people start relying on the rules and the judges and the equipment to keep them safe, and so they go full out. Okay.
Oh yes.
When there's no competitive aspect to it, but you're testing an interpretation of speed with sharps, the mindset is completely different.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, the other thing to point out is this is after 30 years of experience for anyone listening. When he says, I mean, sure, try it after you do this for 30 years. Maybe. Maybe.
And one thing I do for my students sometimes when I travel and do seminars back in, before COVID and what have you, I would very often take a pair of sharp swords with me to a seminar, and I would go around. I'll set the class stuff to do and check who wanted try this with me, and I'll take the people who wanted to have a go through some sharp on sharp hair work slowly. So their first experience of sharp on sharp is with me, who is keeping everyone safe. And they will actually usually be wearing protection. I will normally wear protection, which makes them relax a bit.
Mm-hmm.
If my eyes are exposed, they tense up a bit, they get nervous. I put a fencing mask on, they relax, even though a sharp sword can go right through a fencing mask. So don't trust your equipment ever.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so the students can get that, oh my God, it's different with sharps experience. Right, which is really useful to have.
Right, right. It's very, very different. Yeah. Well, even it's like going from like even going from a wood sword to an actual dull sword is a big difference. That's
right.
That's a big difference. Going from a what is it? A bokutan to a katana. That's a
bokken.
A bokken.
Yeah.
Big difference. Big difference. I did one class I was in. We cut apples in half, and even doing that, because that was like, well, here's the real thing. We're not gonna. All we're gonna do is cut apples in half. But that's you wake up.
We cut stuff. We cut stuff with sharp swords quite a lot because it's good practice. I mean, you're either testing your technique, or you're testing the sword, or you're testing the thing you're trying to cut. So, for example, we need to know how much protection a particular kind of medieval clothing will give you. So we make accurate reproductions of the clothing, put it on, for example, a leg of lamb, and then attack it with medieval weaponry of various kinds to see whether you can thrust a sword through that kind of clothing, or whether a cut will go through. Right, and some things that we think of as like clothing is actually functionally armor.
And are you putting these?
Difficult to get anything through.
And are you videotaping these and putting them on Vimeo?
Yeah.
Okay, because it sounds like very interesting stuff. I think people would love. Yeah, many people would like to see that.
There's at least one video where a colleague of mine, who's also a historian and was writing a novel about not fantasy, a medieval historical novel where people run around with swords at each other, and he wanted to know how protective various bits of cloth would be, or types of cloth would be, and he had like some linen quilted stuff and some leather and what have you. And he brought this beautiful leg of organic lamb, and we covered it with these various things, and we cut bits off it and put plastic down, and then he made a fantastic curry.
Oh, so you didn't waste it.
No, you wouldn't waste it. Oh God, no.
Very good.
That should be on my Vimeo channel somewhere. Honestly, my Vimeo channel is not organized in any way. It's just a place where I dump videos and then I share links to particular things.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, quite a few of my books have links to videos of me demonstrating things, and so that's all on video. So there's like 500 videos there, but they're not necessarily titled in a particularly helpful way, because I don't use it. I don't use it to kind of catch idle traffic.
Right. It's not the point.
I have other ways of catching idle traffic, like, I don't know, showing up on other people's podcasts.
I hope that works. Well, I know it's late for you, so we're gonna start to wrap this up a little bit. I do want people to know that on his website, which will obviously be in the description, there's a really good, speaking of videos, there is a really good starting video that you can try medieval sword training from a very beginner standpoint, and there are many different classes you can take, pretty much taking it to every different level. Is that correct? And you have
there are basically three ways that I teach, either in person, these days often over the internet, but like live. I have books which I've written, because some people learn best from books, and it's also helpful for many people to have all the material kind of organized and laid out for them in that way. And I have online courses, which all of them are designed to take people from absolutely beginner to whatever level of skill you require in various different styles. I should also point out that probably the most important thing for modern people is most people are not physically conditioned to do medieval martial arts, because medieval martial arts are, generally speaking, developed for professional warriors who lived in a culture that didn't have Game Boys, sofas, TVs, any of that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
And so a large part of what I do is I help sort of modern, like, I'm not going to say couch potato, but I just did say couch potato, so there we go. Let's say couch potato.
It's okay. You're speaking to it's an American podcast. You can say couch potato. I understand where we're at in this country.
Yeah. And the thing is, this is actually the magic thing about swords. This is why this is worth doing actually for a living for me, right? Swords are magic. They attract people who are just not attracted by any other kind of activity, right? The sword is a totemic cultural icon. And some people, when they see a sword, they just go, ooh. And when you put it in their hand, they go, oh, and you kind of see them light up. And that gives them a reason to get up and start moving around. And when they realize that actually, well, let's say they want to do rapier and realize that actually their hips from too many years of sitting and whatever don't quite do the rapier stuff properly yet, they need training to get from where they are to where they want to go.
Right,
so,
right.
Range of motion, flexibility, breathing training, joint care, all of that sort of stuff. To my mind, that's an essential component of the whole bringing historical martial arts to modern people project, right? So an awful lot of the stuff I produce is actually aimed to help people get fit enough and healthy enough to do the arts that they want to do.
Which is wonderful. I mean, it's one of the things that I've had all kinds of physical problems in the last 10 years. It's made it very hard for me to move at all. And I really miss stuff I used to, I used to lift weights and bicycle, and I'm just now able to start to do these things again. But so I always tell people who are anyone of any age, if you're able to do, move as much as you can. And this is a good example of that. It's a very unique way to say, hey, well, maybe if you pick up a sword, it would encourage you to move. Maybe that would be fun for you. You don't like lifting weights, you don't like jogging, you don't like swimming. Trust me, a sword's really exciting. It's a really good way to work out.
I have weights, right? And you pick them up, you put them down again, and it's boring.
Right.
But swords, I mean, literally this afternoon, I was teaching a private lesson over Zoom for this guy who's in his late 40s, early 50s, and has never done any kind of exercise deliberately in his entire life before.
Wow.
But in the last 6-9 months, he found out that you could actually do swords and actually do them really, right? And so he's getting into it now, and it's okay. In 5 years' time, you're either 5 years older or you're dead, right? Those are your options. So you're never going to be younger than you are now, right? And if you haven't done it yet, but you want to, you should do it now.
I think that's a really good philosophy. Yeah. And I mean, I really think movement's important. Obviously, we're moving even less in the last 2 years. In America, we're starting to move around more, but I'm
taking this meeting standing up, and I'm moving around while I'm talking because if I sat down, after a while, my back would start to hurt, and my brain would start to be. But moving on, I can keep going for another hour if you want.
That's fantastic. The other thing I was going to say, I did want to ask you also, if you want to get started in swords, two things. It's a two-part question. One is, what's a good place to buy equipment, especially swords? Because I see shops in malls they're not swords. They're display items. They're terrible. I know very little about swords, and I can look at those and go, ooh. So where is there a good place to look for that? And do you need...
There are many.
Yeah. And do you need anything to get started? If you just want to start training on your own or at a club, what do you need?
Okay. Those are two questions. Let me take them separately.
Okay.
First question is, the right place to buy a sword depends on what kind of sword you want, and it depends on where you live.
Mm-hmm.
Because honestly, if you live in France, buying swords from America is vastly more expensive than it is if you live in America, right?
Right.
Now, most of my swords actually come from American suppliers, most, but not all. But I actually have a page on my website, which is exactly for this question, where I have suppliers that my students, that I've used personally, or that my students have recommended to me. And some suppliers will do you a fantastic rapier, but you should stay away from their fencing gloves, for example. Or others will do you a fantastic helmet, but their swords are rubbish, right? So it's not just what suppliers are good, but what suppliers are good for what things. And it's actually organized according to space. So sorry, geography, so where they are in the world. So, you know, if you're in the States, you probably want an American supplier because the shipping and the tax won't kill you. And the URL for that should be guywindsor.net/equipment.
Okay.
I'm just going to write myself a little note.
Oh, well, I'll have it.
No. Let me write myself a little note.
Okay.
Because I'm just going to check that after we're done.
Well, then I know they can. I'll have the main website in there, so I know they can get there from there.
But I'll check it, and then I will. If that doesn't work, I will do a link redirect thing so that it does work, so that URL will work. But I need
fantastic!
To because I have a mind like a bucket of squirrels. If I don't write it down, I'll forget.
Excellent.
Okay, so that was the first question. So I would say if you're interested in buying a sword, then you need to get it from a reputable supplier. You need to get it for what it is intended for. So if you want to hang something pretty on your wall, by all means get what we call a wall hanger, but don't swing it around because it will break, and that's dangerous, and it's also sad when the pretty thing you bought breaks.
Right.
If you're buying it for training, it needs to be bought from a place that supplies training equipment. Okay? Because the swords you get from the shop in the mall that you were talking about, many of those are not designed to be actually trained with. And the difference is fundamental. It's really important. Well, at least because if a blade breaks, you might have a sharp piece of metal flying through the air.
Right.
I've seen it.
Yeah.
It happens. Right. So that's the first thing. And your second question was, what do they need? To show up. Now, I very firmly believe that ultimately you need good equipment, right? Good quality rapiers, good quality long swords, whatever style it is you're doing. But anybody should be able to start with a stick.
A stick. Right?
Stick. Just any old stick. I mean, not some special fancy stick with. Actually, I should produce special fancy sticks with, Guy Windsor, swordschool.com, like burned on with lasers and what have you. And this is the only stick that you can learn with. No. Any old stick will do. Bit of broomstick, bit of stick out of the garden. It absolutely doesn't matter, because one of the things you need to learn is to manipulate the world around you at a distance using this tool, right? So the point of your stick needs to go wherever you want it to go. And when you swing it, it should only hit the things you want it to hit. Okay, that is a fundamental skill that tracks across all the different sword arts, and a stick is cheap or free. So you can start with just a stick, and you can even get reasonably far with just a stick, because let's face it, that's what most practitioners of Japanese martial arts do. Sword arts. Most people start out with wooden swords and stay there for ages, right? And you can do pair drills and you can do all sorts of things. You can't get the feeling of how steel behaves with steel unless you've got two steel swords. But most historical martial arts clubs, if you show up, will have loaner gear. These days, this was not true 20 years ago, but these days, most historical martial arts clubs will have loaner gear. So beginners show up and they get to borrow often a plastic sword, which is, to my mind, that's not as good as a stick, because at least the stick is honestly not a sword. It's not pretending to be something it isn't.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's a sword-like object. It looks a little bit like a sword, and it's fine for beginners. Clubs that can't afford to buy 20 very expensive swords to hand out to random beginners, right? We'll very often buy 20 cheap plastic swords to hand out to random beginners, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do on their part. So mostly you can get started in a club without any equipment and try it out, see what works. Probably the first thing you want to buy is your own mask, because honestly it gets pretty disgusting putting somebody else's head protection on your face over and over again.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
And again, different styles require different kinds of head protection. A good steel sword, they start at around the $200 mark, and they can go up. My absolute favorite, most beautiful, lovely handcrafted, custom-made sword cost significantly more than the car I was driving when I bought it.
Wow. And does it have diamonds? Is it diamond?
No. It's actually fairly functional. It's entirely functional. It's extremely functional. It's stupendously good at its job.
Wow.
And its job isn't, it's very pretty in its own sort of way. Here it is. This is a thing of beauty.
Oh, yeah. So you maybe describe that for people who are listening.
It's a long sword.
It is beautiful.
Styled after one that's in the Wallace collection in London. And it has a simple crossguard and a sort of shaped leather handle, and what we call like a fishtail type pommel, or a scent stopper pommel actually, which is sort of flat so that you can hold it in the hand. And it is about 4 feet long, and it is very sharp. And the really cool thing about it that you can't probably see over the internet is that it has a Damascus bladed sword, or pattern welded blade, which means that the smith took iron and steel in layers and kind of welded them together and twisted them and welded them together and beat them out, and you get this fabulous pattern. But most critically, at the cutting edge, where these layers come to the edge, you get what is effectively micro steration, right? Which means that it's like a tiny little saw. So it's super sharp, but it cuts appallingly well.
Wow.
Because when you slice, it's like the difference between cutting steak with a normal knife and cutting steak with a steak knife. Right? But these little serrations are microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye, right? But you feel them when you cut. Oh my God, this thing is beautiful. So yes, definitely worth more than any car I've ever been. At least to me. There's priorities,
amazing. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, and I was going to say, you mentioned that you had injuries and what have you that kept you from moving. I firmly believe that it doesn't matter what your restrictions are, there is always something that you can do. Okay? For instance, a student of mine a couple of years ago had a collapsed lung. Right? He's a very tall, skinny guy, and his lung just collapsed. Nothing to do with anything he was doing. It was just the doctors reinflated it and said, "Well, you're a tall, skinny guy. This happens sometime."
Wow.
So for 6 weeks, he wasn't allowed to do anything even remotely resembling physical training. Right? So I taught him meditation, various kinds of meditation. Right? We found one that suited him, and so he could use that. So, okay, he couldn't improve his agility or his speed or his strength or his sword handling skill, particularly during that time, but he got better at concentrating on the things he needed to concentrate on, and better at being okay in his own head. Right? Now, meditation is dangerous. If you do too much of it of the wrong type, it can do all sorts of damage. But think of it. If it changes your brain, it has to be dangerous.
That's interesting.
Right?
I think that's the first person I've ever heard say meditation could be dangerous. That's an interesting point of view.
So meditation, you start with 5 minutes.
I guess.
See how it feels, and maybe build it up to 20. And to my mind, the optimal balance between beneficial effects versus risks peaks at about 20 minutes, once or twice a day. Okay, Some people go to an hour. Some people go on like 10-day long, 12 hours a day meditation retreats. And okay, some people also run for 110 kilometers in a single go without stopping.
Right.
I wouldn't do that.
Right. No.
Right?
Yes.
So,
good point.
So, it's with any training, you have to take it, you have to respect it for what it can do to you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if it has the capacity to make a positive change, it has the capacity to make a change, which then might be negative. Right? You can hurt yourself lifting weights. You can hurt yourself swinging swords. You can hurt yourself literally sitting and meditating. There are documented instances of it either triggering or causing, don't know which, psychotic breaks.
Interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
So, and there's a fantastic book on this called The Buddha Pill. I'm blanking on the author, but he outlines sort of the indisputable case for stating that meditation is not perfectly safe. Right.
It's just
Okay.
interesting. I have I can definitely understand how that might be. I guess I've never been disciplined enough to go beyond about an hour, and I've heard from many meditation practitioners and teachers that 20 minutes is probably the best thing. A lot of this stuff I'm listening to now is just try and be in that state all the time. You don't have to sit down with a pillow and a candle. I mean, there's,
but it's nice.
Well, it's nice. It's nice to take a break from things. And
it can be useful. And of course, we do lots of different kinds of meditation. So, I mean, I have a whole sort of meditation course on this. I have a course on solo training, and it's part of that course. There's a sort of sub course within it, which is just a 6-week meditation training thing, which takes you through 4 different styles of meditating, and gives you ideas of how to work with each one. And then most people then pick the one they like the best.
It's so interesting because I was introduced to meditation a long time ago, and I've done it off and on. I've never been extremely disciplined about it, but I've always got benefit from it. And I've heard from a lot of people, mostly people younger than myself, but not always, who say they just can't do it. They just can't sit there. I mean, I've even heard commentators say this on TV. I just can't stop for 5 minutes and not do anything. And to me, that's a problem. It's scary. It's a problem. It's a problem. It's certainly not helping that we have all these devices to encourage that.
Sure. But 5 minutes is 5 minutes is a big ask for someone who's never done it. Never done it.
Yeah.
It's like, most people when they come to my beginner's courses can't do 5 push-ups. So we teach them how to do 1 push-up, and they get to 1 decent push-up, maybe in a week, maybe in a month, maybe in a year.
Mm-hmm.
But they pretty much all get there eventually. Not all, but most people get to 1 decent push-up eventually. Mm-hmm. Some people show up to their first class of the beginner's course and they can do 50 push-ups without breaking a sweat, and good for them. Lucky them.
Yeah.
They'll have difficulties with other things. But the thing is, 5 minutes is too much, right? I start people on 6 breaths, right? And if that seems like too much, we start them on 1 breath. Can you meditate can you pay attention to your breath for 1 inhalation and 1 exhalation? That's it. And how did that feel? Would you like to do another one?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And most people say, that was right, actually. I'll do another one. And eventually you build it up to 6. When you can meditate for 6 breaths, you're meditating, for most people, it's about a minute.
Right.
And that is enough to generate in most people, most of the time, a beneficial sort of reduction in stress and tension and measurable signs of arousal, right? Like blood pressure. Yeah. And if everyone did 6 breaths 3 or 4 times a day, they'd probably feel a lot better.
Oh, right? Absolutely. And I'd agree with that.
And that when they're sold on 6 breaths, maybe then you take it to 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that's like 30 breaths or something like that. Yeah. That's a lot. Really.
It's interesting.
Not for you and me. Not you and me.
I was going to say, if I go 5 minutes, you go, wow, that was half an hour.
At the 10-minute mark, I'm just really getting into it.
Right.
But I've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
Right? you need to come at it from the perspective of the person to whom this is all new and weird, right? And the trick is, I think, to give them the experience of doing it such that they get some of the benefits straight away, so that they'll get an idea of why it might be worth putting a bit of effort in to get better at it. Yeah. And not, load them up with unreasonable expectations. If I said, okay, well, yeah, if you can't do push-ups on one knuckle, like this, on a wooden floor, then I'm not interested.
Oh,
That's
gosh.
stupid. I would have 3 students. I have
those were the days.
I would have 3. Right?
Yes.
Because only an idiot would do that.
And, well, plus,
I'm one of those idiots.
I'm one of those idiots that used to love doing that. But it's a certain kind, it's the same thing. I used to love lifting weights, but I completely understand why people don't. I mean, I get why would you like to go into a gym full of sweaty people and lift up iron objects? I get why that doesn't make sense to everyone.
Yes.
But, I totally get that.
But so, and then if you can meditate for a few minutes, if you can't move much, then meditation is a good place to go. And if you can move a little bit, then you can do maybe some, if you can control your breathing and can wave your arms a little bit, right? Even if you can't wave your arms a little bit, you can still do a whole bunch of breathing exercises,
right?
Which will, you can create measurable improvements in your ability to deal with oxygen. So in other words, your sort of aerobic fitness, if you like, just by doing certain breathing exercises, because it makes you breathe more efficiently, and there are ways of doing it such that you are training to keep going without oxygen, right?
Right.
And if you can walk and breathe, right? Already, there's a whole bunch more stuff we can do, and it just builds up and builds up and builds up. And if you can actually, if you're actually physically capable of actually standing on your own 2 feet and breathing and actually hold a sword in your hand, right? Then, that's the hard part done.
Well,
after that, it's
interesting how people, it's interesting how people forget how much they breathe. People just kind of, they forget that they're breathing all the time. So it somehow seems like a chore to pay attention to it. It's like, really you're doing this all the time. It's okay. You're always breathing.
But I had this funny experience the other day. I'm learning to fly airplanes just for fun, because flying is awesome. But I have to go and get a medical, which is required before you're allowed to fly the plane by yourself. Right? You have to have a medical certificate. And that involved going to a doctor and getting all sorts of measurements, ECGs. And when he was listening to my lungs, he was like, I need you to breathe.
He couldn't hear anything.
I am breathing. It's like, look, my normal breathing rate is, I don't know, maybe 3 breaths a minute or something, maybe 4.
Wow.
Really slow.
Really slow.
Yeah. Just because that's what I'm trained for. Yeah. And so I said, I was confused, right? Because I was breathing normally. And he said, so I said, do you want me to hyperventilate? I said, no, just breathe. I'm like, I am breathing. This is how I breathe.
This is how I do it. Yeah. Well, congratulations on working on your pilot's license. I actually,
thank you.
I have a pilot's license, and I do. Cool? It's fantastic. I actually fly online with simulators, people all over the world in a simulator. So so I talk to lots of pilots all the time, and they'd be interested to know you're getting a license.
Well, I'm getting a license is putting it a bit strongly. I'm at 11 hours and 5 minutes of flight time so far. So I'm a long way away from any kind of
it took me years. I started and had to drop out for a long time. And when I started again to finish, I found out that it's kind of a common story that people start and stop and start and stop. It's a nice feeling. It was interesting to hear what you had to go through, though, because for our physical, now it's been a while since I had a physical, but when I had mine, it was pretty much, they put a mirror under my nose and they said, you are breathing. All right, thank you. And they sign off. Go away.
I had the ECG and everything, like
wow.
stickers all over you.
Oh my gosh, they do nothing like that in America, unfortunately.
Really? Oh,
not for private. I'm sure it's different for commercial. Yes, they should. Yes, they should.
I mean, if you have a stroke or a heart attack or something like that when you're flying the plane.
Yeah, I'm amazed. I know. That's it. I guess they just figure,
well, metal falling from the sky onto somebody's house.
But it's just you and your friends, so it's no big deal. But yeah,
it's the people in the house.
Oh well, there's that. I know. I completely agree. I was really shocked about how quick the medical was, how easy it was to get a medical, and maybe, like I say, it may have changed. I don't think so. It's pretty much. I mean, I couldn't see very well at the time, and he said, "That's okay." I mean, I can't see any better now, but I think now I would take the test with my glasses on. But it was like, no, that's good enough. You can see.
See, I was
like, what?
Like, well, one of the conditions of my medical certificate is I am medically licensed to fly on condition that I wear my glasses.
Right, and that makes sense.
It would actually be against the law in Britain for me to fly without my glasses if I was solo in the plane, because my medical license requires me to have them, because my eyesight is not good enough for a pilot without my glasses. With the glasses, I'm fine.
Sure, and that's what I was expecting at the time, and they were like, nah, it's okay. It was like 20.
We're a bit stricter about public safety over here.
You are, and that's not a bad thing. People complain about it, every kind of public safety regulation there is, and it's like, yeah, okay, well, it's for you that we have them.
I really don't want to end up crashing my plane on somebody's head. That would be very bad.
No, it'd be very bad.
Not that I have a plane, but still.
Yeah. One of the greatest things I learned when I was taking my lessons was I went to a safety seminar, and they were going through things that might happen, emergencies you might run into. And has this happened to you? Have you ever flown a wood propeller and the propeller broke and my instructor raised her hand? And then have you ever had an engine failure and my instructor raised her hand?
That's who you want teaching.
That's who you want, because every time it was an incident. It was never an accident. It became an incident. It was landed. Plane was perfectly fine. And I also learned that in 90% of the cases, and this is probably all over the world, 90%, it is the pilot that did something wrong. It was something in the chain of flight that went wrong. Yeah. It was rarely the aircraft, and GA aircraft are not well taken care of. But even in GA, good. They're not always here. Yeah.
The Cessna I'm learning in is it was made in 1974. I was made in 1973, so we're about the same age. And it's a bit long in the tooth for a plane, but every 75 flying hours it has to go to the engineers for like checkups and repairs, or every 3 months, whichever is sooner.
Yeah, and that's true for school, for any aircraft out of school here. That's going to be true. Like anything that's rented. The checkups are so
if you own your own.
If it's your plane, the rules are a bit different. Yeah, they're a bit looser. You have there's a longer terms, because you're not flying under. Here it's 123 regulations. If the plane is for hire, it's much stricter how often you have to keep it up. So
it may be the same here. I don't know. I've only ever flown hired aircraft because I fight with swords for a living. And people who are professional swordsmen in the 21st century do not own light aircraft. They just don't.
I can understand that. I totally understand that. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because one of the things we did recently is the drill for what do you do if your engine catches fire after takeoff.
Oh yeah. And
I'm like,
why are we doing this?
Catch fire after takeoff? Are you insane? Why are we even getting into this thing if it's any slight chance that it's going to catch fire after takeoff? Well, of course, it's very rare, but you need to know what to do if it happens. And so you drill it. And actually, one of the reasons that I'm particularly, I didn't do it for this reason, but it just is a happy accident that I'm getting an insight into how a very dangerous activity is made safe through training, right? Which I can apply, many of these things I can apply to how we train instructors in historical martial arts, because that is a naturally and obviously dangerous thing. I mean, swinging swords at people's heads is always going to be obviously dangerous, but there are ways that we can use training and good practices to make it completely safe. And it is astonishingly safe. It's way safer than horse riding and way safer than riding a motorbike and way safer than any of the footballs you care to name, right?
Right.
But one of the reasons that it's so safe is because it's so obviously dangerous, right? So we take all these precautions because the sword is obviously dangerous. But, you know, people driving along in their car and it feels kind of like their living room, and they've got their music playing and they've got a cup of coffee in the cup holder and they're driving along, blah, 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 and it kind of lulls them into the sense of security that, oh, well, nothing bad's going to happen because I'm all, you know,
I'm all comfy.
All comfortable.
Yeah.
Right. And then something happens and people die.
Yeah.
Right.
And also there's, I mean, one thing I thought of when I was, before, I've been interested in flying forever. So when I was training, it's something I thought about a lot. You don't have to go through any of this to drive a car. Your car does not have to be safe to be on the road. I mean, that's very safe. In Europe it does. That's true. And
my car gets checked every year by.
Yeah. See, ours does. Ours does not at all. I mean, it's completely insane. There are rules about, you know, if your windshield is cracked or your tires are too low and all these different things. But those rules are only effective if you get pulled over. Otherwise, they're completely ineffective. But the only thing that matters here is, will it pass the smog regulations, which are kind of bizarre in themselves. I'm all for smog regulations, but the way they measure it is kind of odd. So, but I think about that all the time. If you get in a plane, it has to be, for one, you have to go over it, you know, stem to stern before you even get in the plane. And no one even thinks about that with their automobile.
Well, I've always sort of have a quick eye on the tires when I get in my car, always. Yeah,
it's a good idea.
When the thing fires up, if the oil pressure light comes on or anything like that, I check it. And because cars are obviously dangerous.
Yeah, you're right. It's not that obvious to everyone. They do. I mean, the ads also lull you into sleep. It's like they make it look like the funnest thing to do in the world. And isn't this great? And also, I mean, the other side of that is you can, in most cases, pull over to the side of the road where you can't do that in an airplane very much. Yes,
exactly. If your car goes wrong, again, the safety checks here don't check that the car will run. They check that it will stop.
Oh, but see, that's good. I think that's good. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it's not a service check. It's called the Ministry of Transport check, the MOT here in the UK. And in Finland, it's called the Katsastus, which is basically just inspection. Everyone knows what they mean. And there's a set series of checks that the car has to go through to make sure that it is safe to drive, and that includes things like, is it too rusty? Because if your car is too rusty, then if you hit something, you're going to get the engine in your lap. Right. Yeah. No, we don't have anything like that here. You can drive a death trap. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. That is incredible. Well, we've gotten far off the subject, and I actually have. I've actually scheduled some other things to do today, which is kind of rare. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. This has been great. It's been fantastic. So I'll just wrap her up here and say, you've been listening to Were You Still Talking? This is Joel Albrecht, and my guest today has been Guy Windsor, an absolute treasure trove of information about medieval martial arts, swordsmanship, breathing, automobiles, all kinds of things. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And this is, I say this to a lot of guests, but I'm going to say it again. I hope I can have you back on, because it seems like we could talk more about this and other subjects. There'll be information about how to find out more and possibly start your own swordsmanship training, medieval martial arts training, any type of martial arts training. And there are several books that he's written and that are available, and also that he learned from, that are pretty interesting and worth looking into
So thanks again for listening. Remember to share. The best way to help me with the podcast is just to share it, tell your friends, things like that. So as I always say, be good to each other and be good to yourselves.
Thanks for having me.